Good evening, everyone. My name is Eric Lupfer. I am Executive Director of Humanities Texas. Thank you for joining us this evening. I see the names of a number of friends here in my Zoom list, so it's good to connect with everyone. For those of you who are not familiar with Humanities Texas, I'll just say a brief word about us. We're a private nonprofit organization based in Austin, but with statewide service and responsibility. We're the Texas state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Our mission is to promote the humanities and humanities education across the state. And so we do that through a wide range of programs. As many of you know, we hold in-person and online workshops for teachers. We circulate traveling exhibitions. We award grants and have public programs, including a storytime program that promotes family literacy, also a reading and discussion program for veterans and their loved ones. And of course, we also hold in-person and online lectures and discussions as we're doing this evening. Tonight's program is the first in a series that we're holding on sports in the Lone Star State. So again, welcome and thank you for joining us. One just technical note, we will have time later in this session for questions and answers. So if you have a question over the course of the program, please submit it to the Q&A box on your screen, and we'll address it later in the program. So without further ado, I will introduce our moderator this evening, my friend, Dr. Aram Goudsouzian. Dr. Goudsouzian is the Bizo Family Professor of History at the University of Memphis. He writes and teaches about the Civil Rights Movement, the modern United States, and the history of American sports. At Memphis, he has served as the chair of the History Department and also as the director of the Marcus W. Orr Center for the Humanities. Along with Jamie Schultz, he is the editor of the Sport and Society series published by the University of Illinois Press. I'm pleased to say that Dr. Goudsouzian has served as faculty in a number of Humanities Texas programs for teachers. So Aram, thank you for serving as moderator this evening. I will pass things over to you.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you to Humanities Texas, and especially to Kelsey Tyler and to Eric Lupfer for organizing and hosting this event. This event is the first in what we hope will be a series of events that examine Texas society through the lens of sports. Before we leave Eric, I wanted to say one thing about him. You can also learn about people through sports. And I've known Eric for about 25 years. Back when we were graduate students, we worked at the same boarding school in the summer that had a summer program. And we used to play pickup basketball. And Eric was the perfect teammate, the kind of guy who sets picks, keeps his hands up, keeps it simple, the exact kind of guy you want to play basketball with. And to me, that is a great lens into the kind of person Eric is and the kind of leader that he is for Humanities Texas. So thanks to him. I've never played basketball with Frank Guridy. At our age, we probably shouldn't. But I have read The Sports Revolution with great interest, with great delight. I'm excited to be here with you all for this conversation with him. And what I hope is going to be, again, this ongoing series on sports and humanities in Texas. Let me introduce Frank before I start the questions. He is the Dr. Kenneth and Caritha Ford Professor of African American and African Diaspora Studies at Columbia University. He's also Professor of History and the Executive Director of the Eric H. Holder Initiative for Civil and Political Rights at Columbia. His first book was called Forging Diaspora, Afro-Cubans and African Americans in a World of Empire and Jim Crow. That was published by the University of North Carolina Press back in 2010. It won a whole host of book prizes, the Elsa Gouveia Book Prize from the Association of Caribbean Historians, the Wesley Logan Book Prize from the American Historical Association. Frank's also the co-editor of an edited volume called Beyond El Barrio, Everyday Life in Latino America. That was published by NYU Press. He's the recipient of prestigious fellowships from the Schomburg Center, the Huntington Library. He's a public-facing scholar who's written for NBCNews.com, for the Washington Post, an award-winning teacher who won the Mark Van Doren Award for teaching at Columbia in 2019. And before that, an award he used to teach at the University of Texas in Austin, when he won the Regents Outstanding Teaching Award from the University of Texas. Thanks to everyone here who's attending this event. As Eric mentioned, you're encouraged to drop your questions into the Q&A box. You can add them in there at any time. If it's relevant, I'll try to incorporate them in the midst of my own questions, but we'll certainly leave time at the end to address those questions as well. But now to my first question for Frank. Frank, welcome. Start with the big one. Why Texas? Why by the 1970s is Texas at the center of a changing landscape in American sports? And it's kind of a related question. You call it the sports revolution. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, thank you, Aram. I'm really honored to be in conversation with you. As I told you before, I'm super admirer of your work, sport, and U.S. history. So I'm super delighted to be here. I'm also grateful to Kelsey and Eric for inviting me to be part of this series. It's great to be engaging with Texans or Texas theme issues. I'm in New York, but as you said, I lived in Austin for 11 years. I taught at the University of Texas for 11 years. And this is my way to start to answer your question. When I was there, I arrived in 2004, and the state's collegiate and professional teams were kind of in the midst of kind of a renaissance of sorts, right? UT football eventually won the national championship when Vince Young led them to that glorious win over USC at the 2006 Rose Bowl. The San Antonio Spurs in the midst of their championship run. The Dallas Mavericks were relevant. The Houston Astros. And so, kind of the culture of sports spectatorship, kind of made an impression on me. I knew about it from afar. I had read Friday Night Lights, and I've watched Texas sports for a long time from afar, through the television, which I talk quite a bit about in this book. But I was really struck by not just the fact that sports is big in Texas, but there's kind of a sophisticated kind of engagement with it, and it had deep historical roots, which I just became really fascinated by. And part of that was through a public history project that I was doing when I was the director of the John L. Warfield Center for African American and African Studies at UT Austin, when I started meeting some folks who were really dedicated to to documenting the experience of Black Americans, Black Texans, in the state's sports history during the Jim Crow era. And I met a number of folks on the Prairie View Interscholastic Coaches Association. And I was frankly blown away by the kinds of stories that I heard when I would meet them, when I started to learning and reading about the history, local history in Austin and also different parts of the state, Houston, Dallas, and towns all over the state. And that made an impression on me, right? And so then the opportunity to write this book came about around 2013. And I said, I had always been interested in sports as a fan, as a practitioner of sorts. And I thought, why not take up the challenge of trying to write a book about, an immense challenge, I should say, about the history of sport in this state. And so that's what I decided to do. And it was kind of crazy because I wasn't trained as a Texas historian. So I had to do a lot of retraining of myself in a lot of ways. But I was familiar with sport history, but I had to retrain myself in that field also. And so part of it was like, time and place, as maybe this has happened with you, Aram, in the course of writing a certain book, where this convergence of kind of, your experience in the moment with your own academic personal interest kind of come together. And that's kind of what led me to write the book. And in doing the research, part of the mission of the book is to try to, highlight Texas' impact on U.S. history. And that became pretty easy to do when you start digging around and looking at the impact of Texas entrepreneurs, sports entrepreneurs, actually in the creation of the kind of figure of this sports entrepreneur in the 1960s and 70s, and the undeniable impact of scores of Texas athletes on the expansion of professional and collegiate sport in this country in that period, right? And we knew those stories through like kind of team biographies or program histories, whether it's Darrell Royal, the Texas Longhorns, whether it's Earl Campbell's glorious days with the Longhorns and the Houston Oilers, or Phi Slamma Jamma, the Houston Hugh Cougars basketball program. So there's kind of those sort of team specific histories. But I hadn't seen anybody who had written about this kind of broader context and what led to these sort of emergence of this dynamic sporting culture. And part of the story became tied up in the fact that Texas was essentially in a perpetual state of economic growth and boom throughout the 20th century, right? Particularly in the 1960s and 70s, fueled by the oil economy, right? And the oil economy's influence on every aspect of Texas sporting culture is evident everywhere, right? Due to the fact that many of the owners of the initial professional teams that came into the AFL and the NFL were sons of oil barons, the Lamar Hunts, the Tex, K.S. Bud Adams, and Clint Murkison, right, and others as well, to the influence of the oil industry in the making of a kind kind of the suburban metropolises that lead to the growth of Houston and Dallas, and then the arrival of sports teams in those cities as well. And so you've got this kind of fascinating convergence of a state of perpetual economic growth with the freedom movements of that period. The 1960s Black freedom movements and the 1970s second wave feminist movements, which has an impact in changing the demographics of the sporting cultures, and certainly leading to the destruction of Jim Crow segregation, which then creates opportunities for Black athletes, athletes of color, and women athletes as well. So I just became fascinated by that convergence of all those elements. And that's what I tried to tell. That's the story I try to tell in this book, not just through football, which is what one would expect in a Texas story, but also through different sports of basketball, football, and tennis as well. And so that's the kind of long, short answers to why Texas and why this book.
Thanks. Yeah. I definitely hear you about, and I think other historians who are here will probably feel the same way, that, as you write a book, it's as you get older, especially, you start to associate them with a time in your life, a stage in your life, the ideas in your life. And that's certainly been the case for me as well. And so I can understand that. Let's dig a little deeper on the last point that you were talking about in terms of the Black Revolution in American society, in particular, thinking more about the role of the Black athlete. In an essay that I just wrote, I pulled out two quotes that I thought were easy to sort of juxtapose with each other about this idea. Like, in our understanding of American history and the role of the Black athlete, I think there's sort of two camps, right? And there's a book by Doc Young, an African-American sports writer, called Negro First in Sports, that was published in the early 1960s. It's a very sort of optimistic look about all the progress that has been made. And I'll give you a quote. He says, "The great Negro sports stars are perhaps more responsible for the ever-rising tide of pride among Negroes than any other group of professionals. For they dwell in a world characterized by a more nearly ideal Americanism than any other group." Right? This is sort of sport as a means of racial uplift, a positive idea about the positive role of the Black athlete. And then the other quote comes from Harry Edwards' book, The Revolt of the Black Athlete, published 5 years later in 1969. And of course, Harry Edwards is the architect of the Olympic Project for Human Rights, the planned boycott of Mexico City Olympics, right? So Black power infusing the sports world. And he later reflected about his book, The Revolt of the Black Athlete, that it was written, quote, "to stridently challenge and demonstrably prove the fallacy of prevailing definitions portraying the character of race relations in American sport, to establish an unimpeachable fact that Negroes had no more made it in sport than in any other sector of American society." In other words, sport is a reflection of society's larger racism. So what does your work reveal about this tension? Should we understand Texas sports as advancing Black progress, as reinforcing racial barriers? And maybe as a follow-up question to that, if you want to pile on that, is where does Texas kind of fit into the larger narrative about the integration of American sports, right? We tend to think of the SEC country as the last bastion of segregation, and think of the Pacific Northwest and Southern California as the advancing integration fastest. Where does Texas fit into that narrative? So those are just kind of two related questions that you might want to tackle.
Great questions. The answer to the first question about the role of the Black athlete, it's the ascendance of the Black athlete, from the world of HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, and the Black professional circuits that existed, beforehand, or certainly before Jackie Robinson's breaking the color barrier for the Brooklyn Dodgers in the late 1940s. No question that Doc Young was right to some degree, that the ascendancy and the hypervisibility of Black athletes, because of the growth of the sports media industry in this precise period, the 1960s and 70s, the impact of television, which is able to kind of convey the drama of sports at the collegiate professional level, and even sometimes the youth levels, to Americans in an unprecedented way, through the magic of television and televised sports, that creates an image, a very powerful image, that the advancement of Black male athletes in this period, right? We're not talking about women per se in the same way. That this is an example of the advancement of the United States in this period, right? Of symbols of racial progress, right? And I think that, and I think we could see that in a state like Texas, which is steeped in Jim Crow segregation, steeped in settler colonialism, anti-Black and other forms of racism in Texas. And we are able to see that transformation really happening, on the fields and the courts of Texas sports, in Texas sports venues. But it is absolutely true, partly because that transformation was tied up in the commercialization of sports, that there were certain limits to what that advancement could mean for Black communities per se, right? And so what it meant was, as other historians have shown, that many of the institutions, Black institutions that kind of create the labor power or the athletic talent, whether it's the Texas Southerns or the Wileys or the Bishops or the Prairie View schools and the high schools as well, right? That robust Black sporting culture which existed in the Jim Crow era, slowly declines. It doesn't disappear, but it declines because athletic talent is now moving into the predominantly white institutions at the collegiate and professional level. So that has a negative impact on Black institutions, right? It certainly does. And it also shrinks the possibility for Black coaches to achieve employment. Because what you see happening in this period, again, as others have shown, and you see this in Texas for sure, right, is that the transformation is happening on the field, but it's not happening at the level of management, right? You are seeing some Black assistant coaches, winding up, helping to recruit the Texas Longhorns and helping to recruit, Bill Yeoman's Houston Cougar program, or the SMU Mustangs and the Baylor Bears recruit Black athletes. So there's some possibility for some jobs for assistant coaches, for Black coaches, but not much more beyond that, right? So that's why when Harry Edwards is writing his critique of the sport industrial complex and its racism in 1969, he's already seeing these dynamics at work, right? He's seeing the ways in which only a select few of super talented athletes are able to sort of make it in sports, where the vast majority do not, right? That's still true to this day. So I think the question is yes and it's both, it's both, and it's also tied to the fact that about where Texas is in the kind of larger story of racial integration. And I think that Texas had tended to get overlooked in that story because of the dominance of the kind of SEC schools, the Alabamas in particular, right? And the way we tell the story of the kind of last bastions of white supremacy in college sports per se. And of course, it's pretty well known that the Texas Longhorns 1969 national championship team was the last all-white college football national champion. Because Darrell Royal was late to integration, because he was on top of the Southwest Conference with an all-white roster. He didn't need Black athletes in the same way that SMU and Hayden Fry needed in 1965, and the ways in which the Houston Cougars and other programs who were trying to challenge the Longhorns for space in the college football landscape in the 1960s. So so on the one hand, you see this evidence of kind of, okay, so Texas has its story of resistant programs and resistant coaches to integration. But you also, again, you see this interesting dynamic of certainly the case of professional sports that, it's these sons of segregationists, the Lamar Hunts, right? To some degree, the Roy Hoffines in Houston, even the Bud Adamses in Houston, the King Murkisons, who realized pretty quickly that if they want professional football in their cities, they need Black athletes. And they're making that calculation earlier than some other parts of the state, of the professional Southern football landscape or college or sports landscape. So there's an interesting way in which, it's a complicated story. It's not just that, okay, the Deep South or Texas is just like the Deep South and resisting integration. There's evidence of both. There's evidence in the story I always tell is the Hayden Fry story, right? Hayden Fry was a West Texan, right? A white West Texan who was raised in segregationist Texas, who took the SMU job in the early 60s on the condition that he could recruit Black athletes if that's what he wanted to do, right? And so, one of the things I try to do in this book is to show that there are moments when people step outside of history, right? They step outside of the role that's designated for them. And those decisions need to change. And I think we see that clearly in the case of Fry. We see that clearly in the case of Guy Lewis, the head basketball coach at the University of Houston for many years. And much of that interest is altruistic, but it's also self-interest because they want to win and they want to generate revenue for their programs, right? And so you've got the economic incentive there, but you also have the kind of moral transformation that you see happening in American society in that period. So, I think Texas' story is relevant because it invites us to have a more complicated view of the integration story of the South, right? It's not just a simple Bear Bryant, story or Darrell Royal story of resisting integration to the end. It's really a story of transformation happening, in these sort of surprising moments and surprising programs.
Thank you for that. On the heels of that, the other big transformation that's rocking American society, predicted by the early 1970s, is second wave feminism, the modern women's movement. And if you're to ask someone, what's the connection between Texas sports and the women's movement, I think anyone who knows the subject is going to gravitate, of course, to the famous Battle of the Sexes, right?
Yeah.
In 1973, the match between Billie Jean King and Bobby Riggs in the Houston Astrodome. It's a mass spectacle. It's played up for television. It's on Wide World of Sports. Howard Cosell is there. It's the water cooler debate between between office workers. Husbands and wives are betting on the game, right? It becomes a sort of stand-in for it's the story that I lead off in when I'm lecturing about the women's movement to my regular U.S. history course, because it's such an easy way into that. But you're telling a wider story, right? You're not just narrating for us the Battle of the Sexes. You're giving us some figures in Texas sport history who are sort of central to the development of tennis, central to the modern women's movement, and Rosie Casals, and especially Gladys Heldman. I wonder if you could just sort of develop that story for our audience today.
Certainly. Yeah. No, I think in that chapter, the Battle of the Sexes is kind of the bookend. The story really begins in Houston in 1970, right, with the creation of the first women's professional tennis tour, in which you see again a convergence, a really interesting convergence of Texas-based tennis athletes like Nancy Ritchie, San Angelo's Nancy Ritchie, who was a childhood prodigy, extraordinary tennis player who, tried to make a career for herself in the amateur circuit and suffered through all the discrimination that women players had faced in the 1960s. She joins this group, which becomes known as the Original Nine, that creates with Gladys Heldman the first professional tennis tour in Houston, right? And so when you dig around a little bit in Houston's history, you see this interesting kind of tennis circuit itself, right, that already existed, and existed in other parts of the state, not just Houston. But it provides this kind of context that allows these players to come to Houston in September 1970, and they join with Gladys Heldman, who was this Upper East Side socialite woman from New York who lived in Houston and got to know the Houston tennis circuit, in the 1950s and 60s, before she was back and forth between New York and Houston. Comes back to Houston, uses her contacts to create this tour, this small little tennis tournament in this this club in West Side of Houston, and she's got access to the advertising dollars, the oil money again. Her husband herself was an executive of Shell Oil, the oil again, and then of course the contacts she has with Philip Morris in New York that helps finance the creation of what becomes the Virginia Slims tennis tour, right? And so really the story starts there. It starts with, certainly the Billie Jean Kings and the Nancy Casals, but, it starts with these women who are kind of like suburban, not suburban, I'm sorry, they're kind of from the Southwest and West, many of these players, with the exception of the Australians who joined the movement to create the tennis tour, the Virginia Slims tennis tour. But they're not from the kind of country club upper crust at all. They're in their own way, kind of middle class kids who learn tennis on the public courts in Houston and in California and in other parts of the Southwest. And they're the ones that come together with Gladys Heldman and finance with that oil money and tobacco money, is the ironies of capitalism in this story, to lead to this radical transformation in American sporting culture, right? And took enormous risk, as they would say, and they have said for the last 50 plus years, to create this tour. So you really can't understand Battle of the Sexes at all without understanding the backdrop of what had been transpiring from 1970 until that memorable match in 1973, right? And again, I think we know that story if you know the Billie Jean King story. It's kind of a biographical story. Nancy Ritchie is just somebody who just kind of gets overlooked over and over again. The kind of Texas context, the financial context, the cultural context gets overlooked over and over again. And this book is trying to put that story that we associate with amazing individuals and gives it this broader historical context, so that we can see how this kind of dynamic sporting culture is helping lead to these these major transformations. It creates this what becomes the WTA, and this massive multi-billion-dollar industry that's been wildly successful, and proving, of course, that spectators actually were interested in women's sports. And it was tennis, really, it was one of the first sports, the irony again of the country club sport of tennis, that showed that in fact that people were interested in women's tennis, and that there are amazing athletes who were performing in that circuit, and that's what that circuit wound up showing from the 1970s until in subsequent years.
Something on that idea of your study of women and gender in this book, the other big theme that you tackle is the presentation, the marketing of kind of a more classic white feminine ideal, right? You're talking about the drill teams going back to the 50s, like the Rangerettes, but then of course the mass marketing of the Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders by the 70s and 80s. You call it at one point, you say that women's sports in Texas can highlight what you call the quote the contradictions of the sexual revolution as told through sports. So I'm curious if you can develop that one.
Yeah, when I first decided to write this book, one of the first chapters that came to mind was the chapter of the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders. Because one, I wanted to tell the story of sport, beyond what we would typically think of on the fields of play, although certainly the cheerleaders are on the field or on the sidelines, right? In a literal sense and a metaphorical sense. And I thought that there was a fascinating story to tell there that had been told. And so what I wanted to do with that chapter was to, yes, highlight this contradiction that's happening in the 1970s. So you've got the creation of the women's tennis tour. You've got Title IX, right, which then, as everybody knows, who knows the history of women in sports, creates this enormous change for women and girls in this country, creating unprecedented possibilities, opportunities for them to participate in sports. Not to necessarily earn a living per se, but certainly participate, right? And then you've got this kind of institution that existed before this era that had attracted, kind of athletically inclined women, but kind of put them in the realm of cheerleading and drill teams and dance teams, things like that. And that kind of continues and actually gets more popular in this moment when feminism is making enormous gains in American culture, in American society. And so that's the story. I kind of put those things together. But I want us to think about these cheerleaders as the way we think about the athletes. They're workers, right? To be a dancer and a cheerleader, whether you're laboring for the Kilgore Rangerettes, in the 1950s or before, or certainly if you're under the regime of the Dallas Cowboys trying to kind of make it on the Dallas Cowboy cheerleading team and making you $14.12 a game, as they did at that time, without any other expenses paid, you had to work hard. You had to train just like those guys do their 2-a-days in training camps in the summer in the hot Texas heat. And so I really want to emphasize the ways in which this is another form of gendered athletic labor. What cheerleading is, right? Uncompensated or undercompensated gender athletic labor. So that the story of the cowboy cheerleaders is a story of exploitation, for sure. It is a story of objectification and sexualization, for sure. It is the story of how television and how kind of male-dominated TV executives are making these women into sexual objects on Monday Night Football, on all the well-known shows on ABC and the network television, and then eventually on and on until the present day. But it's also about the ways in which these women were able to make lives for themselves, and because they had aspirations, to make it in society. And for them, even with those limits, cheerleading and dance for the Cowboys was one way to do that, right? And so again, I'm trying to kind of emphasize to kind of open up the thinking, just like others have, and just like the cheerleaders themselves have argued in recent decades, when they're making their point about their undercompensation, that cheerleading is work, right? And it's central to American sporting culture, and it generated enormous profits for the franchise like the Dallas Cowboys, right? And so, that's the story I tell in that chapter, because I want us to, kind of have the view of sports from different lenses, from the field of play, from the press box, from the management seat, and from the sidelines where the cheerleaders are dancing, as they still do for NFL and collegiate and high school and middle school, sidelines to this very day. And that's also central to Texan sporting culture. I mean, every Texan knows that they've got stories about, the drill teams they participated in or the cheerleading squads they were part of. It's huge. It's in and of itself. It's its own industry, as we saw in the Netflix series Cheer, which was set in Texas as well a couple of years ago, right? And so there's our understanding of cheerleading and dancing is way more advanced now. Thanks, not really thanks to my book per se, but certainly thanks to the kind of stories that have come out in recent years.
So interesting to lay side by side the story of the Battle of the Sexes with Cowboys cheerleaders and think about them both in terms of the more obvious distinctions, but also in terms of the continuities that you're suggesting here. This is a great time to work in one of the questions from the Q&A, and this is coming from Courtney Cox. And she says, what a joy to hear you talk about your book. It's been so helpful to me in my work. Can you talk a bit about organizing all these elements together for this project? You take us from cheerleaders on the ground to blueprints for a stadium, college to the pros, everywhere in between. You take us across a very large state. What were the challenges / opportunities in aligning the archive / sources and sustaining your argument across these spaces. And just to kind of echo that, I think one of the real remarkable aspects of this book is that you're asking big questions, that you're willing to tackle a lot of different stories. A lot of sport historians can get narrow, and you think big, you think wide. So I think the question from Professor Cox is a really important one. How do you conceive of this, and how do you work it on sort of a practical level as a historian?
Yeah, great question, Professor Cox. I'll talk about the challenges. I'll talk about the things that I didn't talk about. It's very, very hard to write this book and skip over things like Texas Western in 1966. Yeah, that feels almost sacrilegious, right? The story that people know, right? The very famous Texas Western, now UTEP team that defeats the all-black team, that starting five that defeats the Kentucky Wildcats in the 1966 NCAA championship. I talk about that in passing, even though it's historically significant, right, in the evolution of integration in collegiate athletics. But I felt like the story had kind of been told, and I wanted to kind of focus on stories that hadn't been told, at least to my satisfaction, right? So part of it was sort of acknowledging what I'm not doing. This is not a Friday Night Lights book. This is not a view of Texas sports from the high school level. If I had stayed in Austin when I wrote this book, I had actually left in the process of working this book and I moved to New York. I think I would have provided a more grassroots view of Texas. I had visions of writing about soccer, grassroots soccer scenes in San Antonio, things like that. I couldn't do that. So I had to kind of work remotely in a certain kind of way, which is sort of unexpected. I didn't expect that. I thought this was going to be an easy book to write from a practical standpoint, but I left Texas and then it became more challenging again. So part of it was that. So certainly when I get questions all the time, like, why didn't you talk about this? It's like, well, I did. So why did I focus on what I focused on? Because, I'm influenced by African-American and ethnic studies conceptions of history, right? And so I wanted stories that reflected the ethnic and racial diversity of the state, right? And I think this is really important for the non-Texan reader. If there's somebody who's not from Texas to read this book, and being in New York just drove this point home even more so, that I think that much of the rest of this country has a very simplistic understanding of what Texas is like. And I was privileged to live there and get to know the place. I'm not a native. I'm married to a Texan. That certainly helped me, in some ways. And I wanted readers to understand that there's vibrant Mexican American fan cultures in the state. That there's this long history of Black athletes in the state, right? There's a really fascinating history of women in sports in the state. These are things that I don't think people often talk about. They might talk about football, they won't talk about Biciter's Friday Night Lights, and that's kind of the story often, right? And then the fanaticism of football culture in Texas and its alignment with Republican politics and conservative politics, right? Which of course is part of the story, but it's not the only part. So I really wanted to provide a wider view of what I think readers who are not Texans would think about, right? So that meant that I wanted to have a kind of gender balance in the story. I wanted to have a kind of multiracial view of the story. I certainly talk about white Texans and their influence and their undeniable, but I wanted to make sure that there was some balance there. And I chose stories that I think reflected that balance in some ways, right? So that meant that, the book is privileged more towards the urban centers. It meant that I don't talk about rural Texas that much. I talk about it a little bit in the first chapter, but that's about it. And so those are my commitments, right? I think, I didn't drive the story, but it was certainly reflected my vision of what I think Texas was and is as a society, as it's, as an American society, but one that has its own unique histories. And I wanted to kind of reflect that, in my story of Texas. And I think that shaped, some of the decisions that I made in writing the book. And then obviously, as a historian, you need sources per se. And, I think I'm privileged to have worked in this digital age, which has really helped me as a sport historian. I use traditional archival sources. I was, looked at the archives at the University of Houston, SMU, obviously the Briscoe Center in Austin. I dug deep into the microfilms of the San Antonio newspapers. But this book came alive thanks to the efforts of people to post a lot of Southwest Conference football highlight films on YouTube, from the mid-1970s, sponsored by Humble Oil, right? The telecast of random Texas Ranger games random, regular season college football game, not to mention the classic great, games like the Cotton Bowl between Notre Dame and Houston in 1979, or even the University of Houston's Cougar victory in the Cotton Bowl 1977. All that stuff's on YouTube. So it allows me to recreate, these kind of iconic moments and lesser known moments in the book without having to resort just to what the journalists wrote about. And I think that, to me, has been a revolution in my writing about sports. I think now we can complement what the sports writers wrote about. You write about sports writers now, so I know this is something of interest to you, Aram. With the wealth of visual materials that are available online now, and I think that's radicalized the way I work now, and it's created all sorts of source possibilities. And I think you see that in the book, right? So there are many moments when I'm giving you a sense of, Earl Campbell's very famous 81-yard touchdown run in the fourth quarter of the Miami Dolphins Houston Oilers game in November 1978, because that's on YouTube, right? With Cosell's call, right? Among many, many moments like that, that I really try to bring into this book.
It's interesting.
It's a great time to be doing sport history. I think there's just enormous sources available to us now. I think that create all sorts of narrative possibilities.
Well, one of my common critiques of a lot of academic sport history is that academics often forget exactly what makes, or at least across the road in the writing, that they forget what makes sports so appealing in the first place, right? They forget about the drama, they forget about the characters, they forget about what they have to be able to relay that to their audience about. Before they can explain the significance. But one great thing about this book is the way that it does incorporate some of those aspects of more traditional sports writing.
Yeah, that was certainly something I wanted to do. And of course, I lean on sports writers and show us how to do that. They've been doing that forever, right? So, absolutely. That was a big part of the way I wanted to tell the story.
I want to jump ahead to a question that I was going to say for the end, but it kind of connects to what you were just talking about. And that's your chapter on the Spurs. When we spoke before, I got the sense that you were that was the chapter you were the most proud of, or the most happy with. And for me, it was a very eye-opening chapter. As a non-Texan, I felt like I learned a lot about subcultures in Texas from reading that story and how they connect to sport. Why did you choose that chapter? And what were some of the surprises along the way? What was that process like?
I'm married to Mexican American in San Antonio, and I had no choice. No, that's not true. That's actually not true. But it is true that my immersion in sports spectating culture made an impression on me, right? Because of the ways the Spurs clearly have an organic relationship to the local Mexican American community. That's not just marketing, and I wanted to know why. How did that happen, right? Got to go back to the beginning of the franchise when it moves to San Antonio from Dallas in 1973, right? And so that chapter, in some ways, is a story of successful marketing. Marketing matters, right? But in a moment when this was not professionalized marketing, this is just grassroots. This is a franchise that needed butts in the seats, fledgling ABA franchise that was failing miserably in Dallas. That's a chaparral. The franchise is leased to like a bunch of executives in San Antonio, the recently departed Red McCombs, and of course Angelo Drosos, died years ago. How are we going to make this franchise work? Well, this is a city that has at least 6% of it Mexican American people, right? So we need to demonstrate to the laboring majority of San Antonio, which is primarily Mexican, right, that this is a franchise for them. And so they're able to come and cheer on those Spurs, at low ticket prices. And they're, like the rest of the fans chugging down their Lone Star beer and all the other beers that were available in San Antonio at the time. And they had a great time because they were seeing compelling athletes perform for very little money in San Antonio. The George Gervins, the Larry Keenans, the James Silence, all the legends that now, that we know about in San Antonio sports history. And so, in some ways, I wanted to write a history of fandom. Marketing and fandom, right, and athletic talent, and those are the three elements that came together to create, the Spurs phenomenon that then, skyrockets in subsequent decades. David Robinson, of course, the Tim Duncan and the great Popovich era, but its roots are in that period of, I would argue, far-sighted sports management, luck, right, and obviously astute, recruitment of players and signing of players. In a moment when there's abundant Black athletic talent available, and this is something that Bob Bass, the legendary coach of the Spurs in the mid-'70s, says himself at the time, that he became successful as a coach when he understood that he needed Black athletes, and he needed to coach them in a way that showcased their talents right? Not just, kind of fed along a sort of set pattern of the way he learned to coach basketball and play, decades before. That's far-sighted coaching, right? And so you've got those elements coming together to create this remarkable scene in San Antonio that really predates things that we've seen even in Los Angeles, in other areas in New York, where you've got substantial Latinx populations. But the franchise's relationship to those populations is much more remote. The Dodgers gets credit for this, since the Fernando Valenzuela era. But the Spurs are really pioneers in this front, and that story just had not been told because the Spurs story just gets overlooked over and over and over again. And I wanted to make it part of the story, and I wanted to make that a Texas story because it is. And so those are my commitments to that. And it became really easy because you're writing about, extraordinary talents like George Gervin and, like I said, Larry Keenan and they tried to challenge the Lakers in the late 70s and 80s. And, they're able to overcome them at that time. But nonetheless, it's a remarkable period in the history of the team, in the history of the city, and in the history of sport marketing, I would say.
One of the great things about that chapter is its bottom-up approach in terms of really immersing us in the experience of the fans. I thought that was an interesting counterpoint to a theme that you've alluded to a number of times in your various answers, and that's kind of the top-down approach, right? The role of there's some significant business history in this book as well. You've alluded to the role of the oilmen, the Lamar Hunts, the Clint Murchisons, the politician entrepreneurs like Roy Hoffhines. How should we understand their place in the sports landscape and their larger influence? What's their particular contributions, not just to what Texas sports looks like, but what American sports look like?
Yeah. Well, it's a story of the good and the bad of the growth of the sport industry in the United States, right? And how this just I think extraordinary. I mean, it probably isn't extraordinary as I think the 20th century historian thinks things in the 20th century extraordinary, and in their earlier periods are also extraordinary. But this really interesting convergence of sport capitalism, sport marketing, with democratic transformation, social transformation, cultural transformation happening alongside each other, and this book shows how they intersected, right? So and they intersect because people are, have this, as I said earlier, this kind of moral transformation, and they intersect because they see the business opportunities of having integrated playing rosters, right? Or showcasing women's athletic talent, in the form of cheerleading or other forms of women's sports at the time, right? So so I think that I think the role of the capitalist entrepreneur is decisive, is extremely important, right? But they need the athletic labor to make it happen. I think too often when we, in our kind of post-Moneyball age, we are very quick to kind of give credit to the brilliant, general manager, the owner, and far-sighted businessmen, et cetera. But without athletic labor, they're not much. They have no influence in sports, right? So I'm really trying to show how both of those, it's kind of this interesting alliance, an old-fashioned interesting alliance of capital and labor in some ways, right? Between the athletes, and that includes the college athletes, because they're laborers as far as I'm concerned, and those who employ them, whether they're signed with the contracts to the San Antonio Spurs or the Dallas Cowboys, or they're giving them inducements to come play for Ron Meyer's SMU Mustangs in the late 70s and early 80s, right? So I think that I think what made sport magical is that kind of dynamism, that economic dynamism that existed in the state at the time until the oil crashes of the early 80s. And that's when things sort of peter out. That's where I kind of end the book. But I think that their role is extremely important. I think Roy Hoffhein's figure in Houston is oddly overlooked. It's really interesting how he was a visionary, and he transformed the way we think about stadiums, and spectating culture for better, for worse, right? But I think he plays an enormously important role in 20th century stadium construction and post World War II, sports history. And I also feel like he was kind of an overlooked figure for some reason that I still don't quite understand. So you need to have both elements in the story, and I thought that I was really, because that's what I saw in the archives, and I think that this book is trying to balance the influence of both, management and coaches as well. Darrell Royal's program is kind of peating around the mid 70s because they were slow to integrate. And meanwhile, these other programs like Bill Yeoman's program at the University of Houston is ascending because they were not slow to integrate, right? And so it's also about coaches who also saw where the winds of history were changing, were moving, and they moved along with them. So again, those figures are extremely important in how we understand historical change, social change, and in this case, in sport history.
And just again, to encourage our audience members, please feel free to drop questions into the Q&A, and I'll relay them to the best of my ability. My last big question is asking you to talk about a little bit more about your current project and how it grows out of the Texas book. Your new book that you're working on is on sports stadiums, right? Can you tell us more?
Indeed, it is. The book is supposed to finish it right now. It's called "The Stadium: An American History of Protests, Politics, and Play." So I started writing about stadiums in this book. So I spent a lot of time talking about. We haven't talked about it tonight, but we talked about Roy Hoffman's the influence of the Houston Astrodome and also Texas Stadium in Irving, the old Cowboys home stadium from 1971 to 2008. In the evolution of stadium construction in this country, right? In the ways in which it transforms sports spectatorship, from something where you sit on bleacher seats in hot Texas sun to suburbanized indoor comfort, and for the affluent VIP luxury suites, right? So the Astrodome kind of pioneers that trend in stadium construction, and that becomes essential to all stadiums after 1965 when the Astrodome is opened. Right. But I felt like there's a bigger story to tell about stadiums. And I saw it in the evidence that I saw in Texas, but I felt like it deserved its own book. And so now I'm writing a book about what I think is an American institution. Well, there are institutions in other parts of the world, but stadiums are institutions. They're not just places where you see your favorite team play. They're not just places where you see your favorite concert performer perform. They have an enormous civic, political, and social role in American history. And that's the story I want to tell. And not just outdoor stadiums, but also indoor facilities, arenas. They emerged in the mid-19th century out of not just the baseball world, but of this kind of, 19th century amusement world, like the circus, boxing. And they lead to the creation of these edifices that become indoor arenas or outdoor arenas. They have a huge role in the expansion of college football in this country in the 1920s. And they play enormously important civic protest roles, political roles, and they are political because they require enormous public investment to build them. So I'm really committed to the reader understanding that these buildings that we can't stop building in the 21st century, have an important role, although we're building too many of them now, in American the political economy of cities and towns, and also in American civic political life. And we saw that very clearly in 2020 when athletes, transformed stadiums and also spectators and protesters into sort of essentially public squares, throughout the country. Certainly with Colin Kaepernick before that and other movements before that. So I'm going to try to explain, why we've got this ubiquitous institution, how we got here, and even what we might do with them in the future, because they're not going to go away. But I do think that there's a bigger public import that they could provide that we really have underemphasized in the way we think about them now in the present.
Sounds fascinating. We'll have to do another Humanities Texas event when it's done.
Sure, it's supposed to come out next year.
All right, I'm going to turn to a question from Greg Smith in the Q&A. He says, this question pertains to, quote, regular Black professional athletes in basketball, football, and baseball, in other words, not the superstars.
Yeah.
Do these individuals encounter racial prejudice in their, quote, civilian, non-sport lives? Housing, jobs, after sports career, public accommodations, questions along those lines. He's basically asking, what's the plight of the Black athlete in Texas, vis-a-vis these, both the process of economic growth and boom and the sort of the need for Black athletes for success, but side by side with the tensions associated with the civil rights and Black Power eras. Yeah,
great question. It depends on the context. Certainly, in certain local contexts, where high school sports is really important. I know there's plenty of evidence of Black athletes, having a sort of, post playing notoriety, and sometimes that leads to possible employment or job prospects. But I think the promise of upward mobility through sports is largely a myth. And I think that, I think we see that over and over again, and we certainly see that in the case of football, because football has enormous, negative impact on the body and the brains of football players that show up in subsequent years, sometimes not even that much further after their playing days. So yes, it is what we do see in the Texas story. I think is emblematic of what we see in the broader U.S. context. That certainly those who are lucky enough, who are talented enough to make a living in sports, are able to achieve a degree of notoriety that shields them from maybe overt racism and certainly discrimination that those who don't make it experience. And I think we see that. That's the vast majority of Black athletes, because what happens in this period is that as opportunities in sports grow, at least to some extent, other opportunities for mobility are shrinking. Certainly since the 1980s, that's the case, right? And so that only puts the emphasis on hyper professionalizing your child and moving to sports, and the pressures of sports even greater than existed in the era that I write about in this book, right? So I think that in some ways it's a failed promise. It's a sense of that if you're moving into sports because you're looking to move up in society and to shield yourself from racism, and that's an enormous risk, right? And people make it all the time, but it's not one that many Black folks are able to achieve, right? And that's also true for Black women athletes as well. So I think that as Howard Bryant, the great sports writer critic, says, the Black athlete is the highest paid Black employee in this country. And he's including LeBron James and the multimillionaire athletes as employees, because the people who sign their checks, right, make more money than they do, right? So, so we tend to think that because so many of these prominent athletes are hyper visibility, that means all Black folks have made it in sports. That's just not the case. It really isn't. And I think that we see that in the Texas story. And as we learn more about the effects of brain trauma, football's effect on the brain, and there's too many sad stories of all football players, for example, succumbing to things like CTE and dementia and other forms of brain disease that have come as a result of playing sports that are contact sports. So there's that story, which is also important to tell. So I tend to, even as I celebrate the achievements of that era, I think in some ways we've overemphasized sports when we think about the achievements of the civil rights era. I think that the hypervisibility of athletes, Black athletes, used to think that, well, that means we've sort of, we've moved past certain things, and not that many people are making that argument anymore, but it led to that belief for a long time. The vast majority of Black athletes are not able to achieve that level of success, or certainly, are able to sort of shield themselves from racism the way that most Black folks are experience. Yeah.
Go back to the Doc Young and Harry Edwards tension that we started with.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
David Galindo has a question that, first of all, he starts by saying he loves your book, and especially the Spurs chapter. But then his question asks you to think about a little bit more about the present day. Do you believe that the demographics of fans have changed over time? And has stadium gentrification contributed to a less inclusive and less vibrant fan culture inside and or outside the arena? And then he has a more academic question that says, also, do you feel that historians should center fans and supporters more and complicate how we understand them? Thanks for your time. So I think there's two really interesting related questions here. Yeah.
Yes to both. Yes, the last two chapters in my book look at the gentrification of stadiums since the 1990s. Yes. The stadiums of the mid-20th century are often criticized, and I'm kind of giving you a preview of one of the arguments of the book, for being aesthetically unpleasing, for being concrete donuts that were ugly and this and that, and we're not, tailored to the particularities of the baseball fan or the football fan. But I would argue the mid-20th century stadium was a much more democratically constituted in terms of who went and participated and experienced the benefits of them. That's certainly what we see since the construction of Camden Yards in Baltimore in 1991, when things started to change dramatically. When we have the emergence of these boutique ballparks that are sports specific, that are supposedly, aesthetically more pleasing, but really are inaccessible to a broad American public. And that's just been the case, more so since then. So what does that mean? That means what you're seeing in many arenas around this country is like a kind of a space of social tension and explicit racialized labor practice, where you see Black and brown concession workers and security guards serving predominantly white or affluent fans, right? And including in places like California, where much of that affluence is also multiracial. So it's not just racialized, right? But there's no question that the stadium itself has become gentrified, and its role in gentrifications in cities has also accelerated since the 1990s. So that's absolutely true. I don't care what the stadium builders tell you. Stadiums don't generate sustainable economic development. They don't, right? Economists who are employed by franchises tell you that, but that's not what the evidence shows. Reputable economists have made that point over and over again. The arguments for stadiums are different. not an economic argument. It should be actually a civic argument at best, right? But that's another story. So I do think that we need to pay more attention to fans. One of the goals of that Spurs chapter is to open up our thinking of who blue collar people are. There's all this lore about the blue collar fan, right? And they're always imagined as a working class white man. And sports fans come in various guises, right? And blue collar in San Antonio is Mexican American. Blue collar in a lot of cities and towns in this country are not white, or they're multiracial, right? And not all of them are frustrated, white folks who are angry at the black people and the brown people making all the money, performing for them on the court, on the field, right? And I think if you go to a soccer game, you see that clearly. I mean, there's just various kinds of fan culture that are worthy of investigation, I think, historical and contemporary. And I think that it allows us to understand, it will enhance our understanding why sport matters so much to people. I'm not convinced it just matters because they want to see their teams win. I don't think that that's the only thing that brings people to the ballpark or the soccer field, pitch, or the basketball court. They want it because they're experiencing a sense of community, and especially since the pandemic, when it was very clear how important fans are to American sporting culture. So that very clearly with the shutdown of 2020, and how important it is to congregate. This is one of the last in-person space of congregation that we have in this country. And so that's not just because sports franchises summoning them to the ballpark. It performs this important cultural function and social function in our country, in other countries, not just ours. And I think that there's more questions to be asked about the history of fandom that we have a very simplistic understanding of who fans are, I think. And I think the media talks about them that way, but I think even historians themselves haven't opened up our thinking about who fans are, who shows up at the ballpark, who sells tickets, who works at the ballpark, all that's part of that. They play central roles in American sporting culture.
It's an interesting question, and one that I think historians have only scratched the surface on. There's a book by Aram Goudsouzian. It's called Sports Spectators.
Of course.
There's a nice little literary history that was done by Noah Cohen recently.
Yes.
About ideas of sport fandom, but it's a harder topic to tap into, right? The sources aren't on the surface necessarily, but I think your Spurs chapter proved there are ways to do it and to do it successfully.
Thank you.
I didn't ask you about college sports in the 1980s, and particularly SMU, but luckily one of our audience members did. The question asked, the SMU recruiting scandals in the 1980s are often treated, and probably rightfully so, as one of the worst examples of commercialization and corruption in college athletics.
Yeah.
And I agree with this sort of, I was struck by your treatment of it, like that you focus much less on that. Your treatment of the topic brings a fresh perspective by viewing the players involved as an often exploited laboring class, operating rationally in their own economic self-interest. When writing an academic work about college sports, how do you balance that tension between the many failures to live up to academic ideals and sports' powerful influence in other areas like economics, popular culture, and of course how that shapes the university, right?
Yeah,
people often call sports the front porch of the university.
Yeah, that's good questions. Well, the way I dealt with this question is to kind of move away from the academic failures of sports, college sports. And as I said earlier, in my view, what you're seeing in college sports in this period, in the integration era, is the influx of the Black athlete into this labor market. You're seeing a transformation of a labor market. That is what I'm arguing in the book, right? So that means that, the SMU recruiting scandal, which has this lore, of course, being the worst and representing the excesses of corruption in college sports. It's just part of a bigger pattern that we're seeing in that period and in the entirety of the Southwest Conference, for crying out loud, and in the entirety of college sports. You know what I mean? So, there's that great 30 for 30 documentary, which I adore. I think it's called Pony Excess, which I leaned on heavily in thinking about writing this chapter. But even that documentary is sort of, showcasing this as a kind of pathological figures who are just so obsessed with winning on the field. And that's why this is happening. No, that's not why it's happening. It's because they're the ones supplying the capital to employ, college athletes by giving them fancy cars and house payments and inducements. That's what's going on. And all the programs are doing it, right? I don't care what those coaches say, right? So even the great John Wooden is in the midst of this dynamic at UCLA in the 1960s and 70s, right? It's a national phenomenon. And so I think that so I've sort of sidestepped the academic element of the story because I'm not interested in perpetuating the notion that these are genuine athletes, certainly not with the revenue generating sports. I mean, genuine students, I should say. I'm sorry. That's what I meant to say. So that's kind of how the way I dealt with it. It's not necessarily a satisfactory way of dealing with it. And it certainly doesn't help us understand how we might reform this system, if it is possible to reform. But it does, I think, move us away from a notion that somehow SMU is just so bad and these other programs are better. I'm not convinced. I think that the record shows that in some ways they were just more out there with their with their breaking of supposed rules. But I mean, all these programs are getting put on probation in this period. Houston, UT, all of them, right? So how do we make sense of that, right? I mean, this is a systemic problem. It's not a problem of a rogue program, as is often told, and that's certainly what the Mustang Nation would tell you in that period. That's what they said over and over again, that they want justly persecuted. To some extent, they were right. And so I tend to agree with that argument. So I think that but it does raise these bigger questions, which I allude to when Jackie Sherrill signs that contract in 1982 with the Texas A&M Longhorns, and that really starts the skyrocketing of salaries for head football coaches in Southwest Conference and in the nation itself. So you are saying that seeing the theme that others have highlighted, the misplaced priorities that we see over and over again in terms of college sports and the broader university mission. So those are bigger questions, but I mean, I think now that we're in this kind of NIL phase, I think now we can have a more frank, discussion about what I think what sports is in the university, and it's business, and it's not its academic mission, is relevant in the smaller programs, certainly not in the Power 5 schools. That's what I would say.
Maybe connected to that, I found a question in the chat actually instead of Q&A. It's from Ladora Williams.
Yeah.
And asked you to think about the present day circumstances. She says, what's your opinion regarding why some Black students are returning back to HBCUs versus going to play for PWS, predominantly white institutions, as well as the reasoning behind why there's a large number of white students enrolling in HBCUs lately, although the funding and budgets are much larger at PWS. And certainly we've seen a couple examples of this in recent college sports. And just your thoughts and maybe how it reflects on your larger study of many of the HBCUs in Texas.
Yeah, one of the things I wish I'd talked about some more is about these HBCUs in the integration era. That falls out of the story. They talk about them in the Jim Crow era, and then they fall out. And that's just something I couldn't cover. This book was thick enough. It's a pretty thick book. So HBCUs are in a struggle for survival, like all universities are, and they're under-resourced, under-capitalized, and so that shapes the ways in which they're approaching the role of sport in the political economy of their institutions, right? And that means altering some aspects of the mission, in terms of getting athletic athletes who can contribute to the sustenance of the athletic programs, whether it's brown or white players in HBCU baseball teams or whatever. Now, I wonder about what is transpiring, in HBCUs after the George Floyd Great Awakening, I say sarcastically, around race, right? And the ways in which HBCUs, have sort of come back to some degree into view. And then, of course, the success and then the departure of a Deion Sanders figure from Jackson State. So it's interesting that we're in this kind of moment here where it's hard to know if there's something sustainable behind what's transpiring with the recruitment of Black athletes, and some of them going to HBCUs. I'm not sure I don't know if there's a whole lot of legs there, other than to say that, I do think unlike, well, that's not true. I should say unlike. I do think these athletes have options now. And I think there is a growing awareness of the ways in which the things that Harry Edwards talked about in 1969 are very much part of the dominant NCAA school culture today, which is continual exploitation of Black athletes and mistreatment, and even if it's just the kind of pernicious ways in which racism works and microaggressions. There's just a heightened awareness of how racism works at predominantly white institutions, I think, post George Floyd. And I think that leads some people to think, that's not for me, and that I'd rather go to a Black school where hopefully I would be treated differently. So I think part of it is this kind of post 2020 moment that might reflect a shift, but it doesn't take away from the question of revenues and resources that these schools, have in comparison to the PWIs and the Power 5 schools. And but I also think that there's a bigger story to tell there. I do think that we shouldn't judge HBCUs by the fact whether or not they're turning out championship teams. That's not the story of Black college sports. The story of Black college sports and high school sports is what role these institutions play in the survival of Black communities. I think that's a story that hasn't been told in the integration era, because like this book, I move into the integration, I move to the PWIs, and I leave the HBCUs behind. And there's these institutions continue, for now decades after Brown versus Board of Education. So then, what is that story? How are Black women track athletes able to sort of make it an HBCU setting, for example? I mean, they're going to UCLA and they're going to these predominantly white schools, but there are athletes performing in these schools. There are people getting educations. And that's a story that should be told. It shouldn't just be like, Tennessee State and Prairie View, isn't it? They aren't as good as they were in the 1950s. Okay, but there's still, Black marching band culture. There's so much to tell about the HBCU athletic experience that, I think Derek Whitefoot is a great start. The great book that he did on Florida A&M. And the Black sporting congregation is an extraordinarily generative argument that allows us to see the ways that sport works in Black communities beyond simply looking at them as suppliers of Black labor to predominantly white teams. And I think, Derek White's book is one way to kind of start dealing with those questions in the HBCU in the past and in the present, I would say.
One last question. We're almost out of time. This one comes from the historian Derek Katzum, who, as he notes at the end of his question, is also the color analyst for Permian high football, which everybody knows via Friday Night Lights. And he's written about South African sport, among other subjects. And so he asked, in the new book, are you looking at international issues? In South Africa, FIFA demanded, quote, FIFA quality stadiums that have become white elephants when the country had enough, or at least nearly enough high quality stadiums at the appropriate scale for South African sport. So any international dimension to the stadium project?
Unfortunately, no. Not because there isn't an international story to tell. It's just that I realized pretty quickly that it would just get way too big. I do think the story I'm telling has resonances all over the place. I don't think there's a unique American story per se. Maybe I shouldn't say that, but in other words, one can do an analysis of stadiums in different parts of the world. Certainly, tied to the growth of the mega event, sporting event, whether it's FIFA or the IOC or whatever. There's no question of that in itself. It's its own history, but it just shows up a little bit in my LA chapter because I talk about the LA Coliseum. But again, it's more oriented towards kind of particular LA questions and the question of the Black freedom movement in LA at that time. There is an international dimension, and it pains me to say that because I know those stories are there. It just fell beyond the scope of this book, unfortunately. I envisioned, for example, I wanted to write about the Estadio Nacional in Chile. Why? Because that's an example of an institution of the way in which the Pinochet regime used it as a detention center, used it as a torture center after it overthrows the Allende regime in September 1973, right? The ways in which that stadium houses that memory in that section, Escotilla Ocho, as it's called, Section 8. It's a fascinating story of monumentalization of a national trauma in a stadium space. It took me way too far afield and I couldn't write about it. But those stories are absolutely there, no question about it.
Taking from the absolute flip side of sort of the Welcome to Wrexham story and sort of the stadium as a community building institution. That's obviously very different from what you're suggesting, but it speaks to the sort of the capacious qualities of sport in American or in life in general beyond the shores of the United States. That sport is a lens into so many of the key issues that dominate our lives. A guy I wrote about once, Bill Russell, said it was one of the big four, along with art and politics and war, the big things that bring people together, for better for worse.
Better for worse, yeah. And sometimes drive them apart too.
The heart of the story that you told.
Yeah, for sure.
Before Eric comes on, just want to say thank you to Frank Guridy for taking the time to speak with us, and thank you to the audience members for the terrific questions and for your great attention. This was a special experience, and I was really glad to be a part of it. Eric,
Aram, thank you so much. Thank you so much. This is a delight, and thank the audience for attending. We can't see you, but I see you there, and thank you for the questions.